You very much for the introduction, Comrade Sirudis. Um, I appreciate you guys inviting me, so thank you very much to the Spaceless Collective. I've heard a bit about what you guys have been doing from our mutual comrade, Dr. Ashraf Kunumal, and I think it's a wonderful work. So solidarity, comrades. So yeah, I guess we can get started. Just to share a little bit about myself. Sirudi shared that I'm currently based in South Africa. I'm doing a PhD here, and I'm an attempted scholar activist. I do my best to stay committed in that space between the academy and the street, sometimes leaning more towards the other. So I'm not sure I live up to the expectations of being a global activist, as Sirudis shared earlier, but I do my best to be a committed human to struggle. So yeah, my webinar presentation today is on the topic of race, religion, and resistance in the praxis of Malcolm X. I first kind of encountered the Spaceless collective through my comrade Dr. Ashraf Kunumal, and I just want to say that I have been very inspired from the work that you guys have been doing in India. I mean, the broader movement, the broader Dalit, Bahujan Muslim movement. My first exposure to your movement and what you guys have been fighting for was when Rohit Vemula unfortunately was martyred and killed. And I had been studying with Dr. Ashraf Kunumal, and he began to teach me about the solidarity and the alliance that you've been building away from the traditional kind of very secular and economic reductionist left that doesn't take seriously the issues of Brahmanism, of casteism, of Islamophobia. So afterwards, I began to learn more about the history of Ambedkar. I read his critique of Gandhi. I learned about the Malabari uprisings from the 16th century up until more recent history. And I've been following you guys in your struggle with the anti-citizenship laws this year. I know it has been a very tough time for you comrades. You've lost some people, literally. People are in jail, but you've also really raised your voice and become a new force and are challenging lots of different formations in the Indian context. So firstly, you know, I'm just very privileged and thankful to share space with you because I've learned so much from your movement and what you've been doing. Before I jump into the talk explicitly on Malcolm, I just have two things to share. The first is that I'm not technically an expert on Malcolm or Malcolmite studies. That is an actual field of study and social practice. But I do engage and have been exchanging a lot with experts in that field in terms of discourse and on the ground with people. And I've also written about Malcolm, and especially from the context of race and religion, Blackness, Islam. So I hope I have some valuable things to share with you all today. And lastly, I just have to also to share, you know, many of us, we were inspired by Malcolm in multiple ways. There's the social movement aspect, there is the revolutionary ideological aspect, but there's also a very deeply personal aspect. If I'm not mistaken, at least many of the comrades who are on this webinar today have read at least the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I just want to share the first time I read that autobiography. I was around 20 years old. I come from a mixed background. My mother's side is white and of Christian heritage, and my father's side is Palestinian of Muslim heritage. And I wasn't raised by my Arab and Muslim side. I was primarily raised by my mother, a single mother. And it was later in life that I came to Islam. And I remember that summer when I converted, I finished fasting my first Ramadan, and I read the entire Quran in English. The colonizers also cut my tongue off, so I've had to learn Arabic later in life. And now all of us are speaking English because we share the same oppressor, the British. They were in India, they were in Palestine, they came to the Americas. So we can thank them for us being able to communicate so easily. But yeah, the next book that I read after that, after the Quran in that time, was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I met with my friend at the time, an African-American sister, who also came from a similar background to me. And we both converted to Islam in that summer. And we both read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And when we came back to campus, we were studying together in Los Angeles. I remember us talking, and I looked to her, her name was Raisa. And I said, Raisa, you know, we have the Quran, this is our kitab, this is our book, this is our scripture. But I swear the Malcolm X autobiography is our Bible. So after that, I used to sleep next to my bed with the Quran and the autobiography of Malcolm X. So Malcolm and his legacy has been something that has influenced and transformed me, as I'm sure many of us as well on this webinar, in so many different ways. I mean, you meet people all the time who either were radicalized politically or they converted to Islam just from reading that book. So yeah, in terms of the topic we have today of race, religion, and resistance, I just want to share with you that I've divided it into 3 parts, just so that this is maybe helpful for you to follow along and see the trajectory of the different kinds of themes and arguments that we're exploring together. The first part is going to deal, we're going to go global to local, kind of big picture to small picture. So the first part is dealing with the wider context of modernity and what creates the world that Malcolm is birthed into in his childhood. The second part is going to deal with Malcolm growing and transforming and the different types of political ideologies and formations he was encountering as he moved to the Nation of Islam. And then the last part will deal with a number of the different ways Malcolm continued to transform after the Nation of Islam in relation to race, religion, and resistance. So I hope that's clear. So firstly, in terms of the global history that we're dealing with, Malcolm's life and his legacy, what he contributed, does not occur in a vacuum, okay? Malcolm comes into existence after almost 400 years of what many in decolonial scholarship call coloniality, right? So it's this wider system of power that post 1492, when Europe or at that time, Western Christendom, was able to expand beyond the European continent as we know it today by way of defeating the Islamic caliphate and civilization in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. Thereafter, going to what becomes the Americas, colonizing, conquering, and genociding the indigenous people in the Americas, beginning the transatlantic slave trade between the coasts of Africa, Western Africa, Central Africa, and stealing millions of Black lives to exploit for labor in the Americas. At the same time, as I'm sure many of our comrades in India are aware, Europe also went to the east at that time, right? So we have Christopher Columbus in the same year that Al-Andalus fell to the Western Christendom. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 to the west. And then you have Vasco da Gama, who goes in 1498 from the same Iberian Peninsula around the Horn of Africa, the coast of Africa, the southernmost tip of Africa, all the way to the Indian Ocean, and arrives in what is now India. So there is a shared beginning at this time in terms of global expansion, and especially from Europe and their military conquests. And when it comes to race and religion, this time period also creates new hierarchies and ways of being based on religion. So the term race, if we can just briefly clarify, many argue, especially in decolonial studies, but also in critical race theory and other academic disciplines, that term in the modern context has its etymological roots in the Spanish word raza, which means race. They share the same Latin root. And that term raza was prescribed to the Muslims and Jews, the Judíos and Musulmanes of Spain, when Spain was busy, in their understanding, reconquering the Iberian Peninsula. And they attributed it to Jews and Muslims because they viewed them, raza meant defect at that time. So they viewed Muslims and Jews in the Iberian Peninsula as ontologically inferior. And when the Spanish at that time moved to the Americas and began the transatlantic slave trade, they took that understanding of raza, of race, which was always from the beginning in the Iberian Peninsula intertwined with a category of religion, because the Muslim and the Jew is also a theological, it's a religious category. And they applied these terms to the indigenous people in the Americas, who had many different names, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, and they said that these people also have raza. And then they did the same with Black African peoples that they started to enslave. They did the same when they went to India. They did the same when they went to Southeast Asia and the Polynesian islands. And this is all happening in what is known as the long 16th century. Okay, so I know we're going kind of long-term, longue durée history right now, but it's important because this is the world system context that informs Malcolm X's setting, his local setting in the United States of America in the early 1900s. So after these 400 plus years of colonial expansion by Europe, by Christendom first for about 2 centuries, and then this thing that they call Europe after, we encounter the setting of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born in 1924 in a city called Omaha, Nebraska, which is in the middle of the United States. We call it the Midwestern region. And what's important to note is that and it's something that's not often acknowledged in Malcolm's life and in his formation. He was born into a family that was very much revolutionary and very much radical. Both of his parents were committed Pan-Africanists. They were Garveyites. And I want to focus on Malcolm X's mother for a moment, because I think this also speaks to our theme of race and religion, which in an objective understanding are social constructs. They are historically contingent, but they are also categories and aspects of our reality that deeply transform and inform the way that we are. So the great Black Muslim revolutionary, Malcolm X, was raised by a mother. Malcolm X's mother's name was, sorry, I'm losing my, my notes here. So Malcolm X's mother's name was Lewis Little. And she was actually, her maiden name was Langdon, and she was born in Grenada in the Caribbean. I'm not talking about Grenada in Spain that the Spanish conquered in 1492. I'm talking about Grenada in the Caribbean, the small Caribbean island. And she became an activist in the Garveyite movement, which was a Pan-Africanist international movement started by Marcus Garvey. For those who are unfamiliar with Marcus Garvey, he is one of the foundational figures in Pan-Africanism from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And his organization, the Organization for the UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, was one of the first transnational Pan-Africanist organizations. And it gave birth to many later formations of Black radicalism, Black nationalism, and the Black left. And Malcolm X's mother moved from Grenada in the Caribbean to Montreal, Canada. That is where she met Malcolm X's father, Earl, his name is Earl Little, who was from Georgia, a state, or as we say in the British system, a province, in the south of the United States, in Georgia. And they both became very committed activists. His mother, Lewis, she wrote many articles in her time for Marcus Garvey's organization. And she also made her kids read and be involved in these issues when they were young, including Malcolm X and his other siblings, who all went on to become very wonderful human beings and people who contributed to the betterment of their community. So it's important to acknowledge this, because it was actually a Black Christian Pan-Africanist woman who kind of laid the foundations for this Black Muslim revolutionary. Okay. Now, when it comes to Malcolm's journey, right? So we've begun to see that even from the time he was born, there were these different different political theories that he started to encounter. And there were also different understandings, understandings of race and religion, okay, that informed his eventual transformations and progression. His father was actually a Christian minister, and he was vocal in his activism, and he stood up to white racists. This is a time in American history which is post Reconstruction, so it's post the period of the mid 1800s, where slavery had formally ended, and Black people are technically free. But shortly after that period, in which Black Americans gained many different types of rights and powers, legal, economic, political, there was a rollback. There was a challenge to their the beginnings of their rise in acceptance through what becomes known as Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, which come into effect de jure from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. So Malcolm X is born in a context where the southern half of the United States has a very, what we might call conservative form of racial segregation that is more explicit and in your face. And in the northern half of the United States, you have a more liberal form of racial segregation that is more implicit, yet still just as vicious in terms of the way it sees racialized peoples, whether Black or Native or other types of groups of people who existed that were non-white. And Malcolm, so yeah, his father actually is killed by the Ku Klux Klan, which, I mean, in your context now, I think you can compare them to these Hindutva Nazi groups who self-organize and are tacitly supported by the state. These white supremacist Christians who didn't like this Black family that was confident and stood up for their rights. They owned land in Michigan, in East Lansing, where Malcolm X and his family had moved to from Nebraska. So after the period of Malcolm X's father being martyred, killed by these white supremacist forces, unfortunately, his mother was not able, because of the social reality she was facing, to psychologically remain stable. The state also targeted her because she was very strong and confident as a Black woman. And she was put into an insane asylum. And Malcolm X and the rest of his siblings became foster children. They were orphaned, and which led to a period eventually in Malcolm X's life, from his teenage years into, I think, his early 20s, yes, where we might describe him as engaging in many forms of underground activity. Okay, so many people have read the autobiography. They've read the stories from Malcolm and Alex Haley's, the writers, their perspective of Malcolm X's journey and what he went through. So he got involved in all types of illicit activities, gambling, sex work, stealing, you know, running kind of with the so-called criminals and delinquents of society. And in 1946, when he is about 22 years old, Malcolm X is jailed for his criminal activities. He had been traveling mainly between three places: Detroit, Michigan. One of his nicknames at that time was Detroit Red, because Malcolm was light-skinned Black, and he had reddish hair. So because he had this reddish hair, they called him Detroit Red. He was in New York City, in Harlem, and in Boston, in the state of Massachusetts. And after being jailed, he was in jail for, I think, 5 to 6 years. While in jail, he encounters the Nation of Islam, which at that time, I mean, it still exists today, but at that time, the Nation of Islam was a burgeoning, what some Orthodox Muslims call a proto-Islamic movement. Others are fine with calling it an Islamic movement. that's sought to empower Black people through through Islam, through an interpretation of Islam. The founding figures of the Nation of Islam are Fard Muhammad, who people called Allah, and then Elijah Muhammad, who was one of Fard Muhammad's followers. And Elijah Muhammad considered himself the messenger of Allah. And various forms of scholarship on the Nation of Islam and on Malcolm's, the Nation of Islam, they make the argument that actually the Nation of Islam it's very likely that they were an offshoot from the Ahmadiyya. If people know the Ahmadiyya sect within the South, I'm sure you do in the South Asian and in South Asian context, because the Ahmadiyya at that time were the most prominent Muslim group doing da'wah or proselytization in the United States. And much of the cosmology, the structure, the way that the Nation of Islam's, their theology, it has certain similarities in relation to the Ahmadiyya, their concept of prophetology, Elijah Muhammad viewing himself as this new messenger, so on and so forth. So it's interesting to think about when we talk about religion and race and what everyone knows as a Black Muslim movement potentially being started from a South Asian minority sect of Islam, potentially. Okay, so yeah. And so, yeah, the Nation of Islam. There's a lot we can say about this organization. They were in many ways a social empowerment movement, but they were also a religious movement. They were attempting to answer the spiritual existentialism that Black people were facing in America as victims of white Christian supremacy. But they were also very political in the sense of forming politically autonomous communities, economically autonomous communities, communities that could be self-sustaining. Okay, so for this reason, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about the Nation of Islam, but for the sake of this webinar, what I want to focus on is a potential interpretation of the Nation of Islam. I just want to double check. Can people hear me well? You can just nod your heads. Okay, thank you, Dr. Ashraf. Okay, so that was part one, and now we're jumping into part two, which is about the Nation of Islam and Malcolm's development within that framework. Okay, so the Nation of Islam, in my understanding, and this is not something common at all. I've never encountered it in Malcolmite scholarship, but I think that this potentially carries some weight. I think we may need to view the Nation of Islam as a type of Black Islamist movement, right? Black Islamism, Black American in this sense. And I say this because there are different understandings of the term Islamism. Some people critique it as a simple colonial construction that Orientalists and Western people labeled Muslim political movements. Other people claim it as any Islamically inspired social movement engaging the language of Islam, which is the definition of Salman Sayyid. And then many other people view Islamism as a movement that attempts to administer or propagate the Sharia, literally meaning path in Arabic, but in a more technical sense, it's related to Islamic law, through the modern nation state. Okay, so when I say Black Islamism, I'm not necessarily saying that this movement was explicitly, in terms of this third definition, attempting to propagate the Sharia through a modern nation state. although they did follow, even if they did not use this word, they did follow many things akin to a sharia. And I mean, the linguistic meaning of sharia in Arabic, I mean, you call different communities. There's the sharia of the Christians, there's the sharia of the Jews, and then there's the Islamic sharia. And it basically means a type of religious law. So if we understand it in that way, and then we understand it in the definition of Salman Sayyid, who argues that anyone who uses the language of Islam to engage in political struggle, right? Then we can see that in many ways, the Nation of Islam fits this description. They followed, just to get to the Sharia aspect, they followed strict religious laws. They changed the ways that they ate. They changed the ways that they prayed. They changed the ways that they spoke. The symbols and signs in their lives were different from their previous Black Christian or nominally Black Christian lives, or even secular atheist Black lives. And they also sought, as I mentioned earlier, to fight for a type of political, cultural, and economic autonomy. They were involved in international trade. And I mean, they were importing fish from, I think, some Latin American country. I'm forgetting which one. But Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, they had a they operated within the millions in terms of the revenue they produced through their businesses, through their imports, through the different types of Black Muslim stores that they set up, the newspapers that they began to run, which Malcolm X spearheaded. Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper that the Nation of Islam created and became a very prominent form of political education for Black people and others in the United States. So yeah, I think we can conceptualize the Nation of Islam as a form of Black Islamism. And this understanding of race and religion in that regard is intertwined. So Islam was a language for Malcolm and many generations of Black Muslims that spoke to all oppressed peoples, and they faced discrimination for choosing Islam and choosing their radical understanding of Blackness in correlation to that Islam as part of their language and their social struggle. So many historical Black Muslim movements and people in the United States were actually targeted by the US state for centuries for being Black and Muslims. The many African slaves who were brought to the United States included within them a significant amount of African Muslims coming from the Western and the Western parts of Africa, right? And I mean, both in what becomes Latin America and what becomes North America, these various authorities didn't necessarily like Islam. So the Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, they saw Islam as a threat to their projects of forced Christianization of the indigenous peoples and of Africans. And in the United States context, Edward Curtis, a prominent African-American scholar, writes that literate African Muslims who wrote in Arabic, whether they were writing in the Arabic language or they were just using Arabic script for their local language, like Hausa or Fulbi, okay, they were exoticized and viewed. These are kind of contradictions, okay? I'll explain this point more. But they viewed these African Muslim slaves as more civilized in certain ways in comparison to their non-Muslim African Muslim slaves. So there was early African American Muslims like the West African Fulbi Prince Abdurrahman Ibrahim Suri, who died in 1829, who was treated better by his white Christian slave masters as a result of what I want to call an American Islamophilic gaze, right? So we have Islamophobia and we have Islamophilia, and Islamophilia is the quote unquote love for Islam, and Islamophobia is the fear of Islam. But Islamophilia is also something that is used in a very racist way, because the power structures, in this case, the Western power structure, will try to make friends with certain Muslims and view Islam as something better than, you know, the non-Islamic African slave in that context. But actually, they do not care for the political agency and autonomy of said African Muslim. So they are still using this Islamophilic approach or Islamophobic approach in other circumstances for ultimately anti-Muslim racist purposes, in addition to anti-Black in the context of African Muslims. So these forms of Islamophilia and Islamophobia systematically disciplined African Muslims to not revolt in jihad against the American power structure, but to conform to their Western, white, secular, and Christian power structure. And if we come back to the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam, by the early 20th century, I mean, one simple way we know that there was always this attention on religion in addition to race is that why didn't African Muslims survive with their Islam? Was because the American state did not want them to stay Muslim. They forcibly converted them in overt and covert ways. And it's in the early 20th century, with the rise of different Black Muslim movements, like the Moorish Science Temple, that's one of them. The Nation of Islam as another. There were also some small amounts of Sunni and Shi'i groups at that time, and also the Ahmadi. So you have these more old world Islams existing there as well. But the Black Muslim movements in the early 20th century are really these vehicles that arise to challenge not only the white supremacy in America, but the Christian and the secular supremacy in America. So in terms of Malcolm's political theory on Black Islamism, when he was in the Nation, and also even after the Nation, I quote, he says, "The Black struggle must also be the concern and the moral responsibility of the entire Muslim world, if Muslims hope to make the principles of the Quran a living reality." So Islam for the Nation of Islam and for Malcolm was a versatile grammar and a fluid vocabulary for Malcolm and many other Black political cultures in the United States, especially during the Cold War, that connected the Black struggle in the United States to struggles in many other places, and especially the Muslim world and oppressed peoples all over the world. So when Malcolm spoke of the expansiveness of the language of Islam at different times, and in this, I'm going to share another quote, in this context in New York, at a gathering of United Nations representatives, he not only deemed Islam the greatest unifying force in the dark world, but he stated, this is Malcolm now, "The unity of 600 million Muslims from the China Sea to the shores of West Africa is a force and a factor that has long been recognized by the major powers of the world. The 90 million Muslims in Indonesia are only a small part of the 600 million more in other parts of the dark world, i.e. Asia and Africa. We here in America were of the Muslim world before being brought into slavery, and today, with the entire dark world awakening, our Muslim brothers in the East have a great interest in our welfare." So basically, the argument I want to make here is that this form of Black Islamism is defined as such. Malcolm engaged this language of Islam, this language of Islamism in three ways: as a name to define the political and to define his ontology; secondly, to counter and defeat an international Western power structure expressed through the language of the West; and lastly, to envision a post-nationalist or an internationalist geography beyond ethnicity that led to an anti-racist, post-Western/white/Christian future. I know that was a mouthful, apologies. But this was something that connected these movements to all Blacks, Muslims, and oppressed peoples all over the world. So while many people have spoken about Malcolm X as a Black nationalist or a Black Muslim, I think for that period in his life specifically, and for the Nation of Islam as a phenomenon more widely, we could also identify them as Black Islamists. And it may be useful to define other Black Muslim formations this way, such as the post-Malcolm, after Malcolm dies, one of the largest Black Muslim movements that precedes him was known as Doddle Islam. They were a Black Sunni movement that continued his legacy in terms of the deep critique of Western, white supremacist, secular, capitalist, Christian supremacy. And it's not necessarily because they wanted to impose the Sharia through a modern nation state, although as I shared, there are many different ways that the Sharia directly informed their social reality, but because Islam provided them a language, a universal language, like many other Muslims all over the world, to formulate a political agency and autonomy against and beyond Western ontology. So yeah, those, just to conclude this part two, I know we're getting to, it's 45 minutes after 4 now, and I'm not even in my last section yet, so I hope that you all will bear with me. Is it okay? Are we doing okay with time, Sirudis? We're okay? Okay. So I know I focused a lot now when we're talking about race and religion on Blackness and Islam in relation to Malcolm's trajectory and the different political ideologies he's facing, okay? But there were, in Malcolmite scholarship, there are 3 political ideologies cited as the main influences on Malcolm's life. One is Pan-Africanism, obviously. There's no doubt in anyone's mind, Malcolm was a very committed Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist, from the time of his birth and his family all the way until his death. And then there's 2 more. There's Pan-Islamism, as I've attempted to argue, and also Pan-Arabism. And these are frameworks and arguments you can find in the writings of Alex Lubin, Hisham Aidi, and Maytha El-Hassan. These are 3 scholars located in the United States. I can share their work with everyone after this talk. I can share with Sirudis if people would like to read more, but they've done a lot of work around the formation of these 3 influences on Malcolm's praxis. Okay, so that's part 2. I hope people are still awake, still following. You haven't fallen asleep yet. I know it's, we started at 7:30 India time. It's 4:45 here in South Africa. It's the winter, so I'm a little bit cold, but this talk is keeping me warm and nervous. The last part we're going to focus on, this is part 3, is Malcolm's transition from the Nation of Islam and kind of Black Islamism to what happens after. Okay, so basically Malcolm began to travel in Africa and Asia in the late 1950s, but especially in the early to mid 1960s, right before his death. Now, his trip, as described in the autobiography, to Mecca to perform the Hajj, you know, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca that all Muslims, if they're able-bodied, are able to perform, should perform. Many people know about that trip abroad that he did, but he actually, and that was when there was a lot of conflict between him and the Nation of Islam, and he was starting to shift and move away from their framework and their formation, their political formation. But he also went in the late 1950s. So I want to be very careful as we make this transition, because it's a very common thing to kind of jettison the influence of the Nation of Islam and its own forms of internationalism and Black radical politics, Pan-Islamist politics. While they may, in certain cases, from the perspective of Malcolm or many others, been limited in their view, their formation and foundation in Malcolm's life and theory and praxis is undeniable. So Malcolm's move away from the Nation of Islam should not be some kind of triumphalist narrative of Malcolm finding, this true orthodox Islam. I'm not against Malcolm or others, kind of making the argument that they believe that the Aqidah or the theology of mainstream Sunnism is the correct theology. But in terms of social struggle and political ideology and even religious formation, I think we need to be honest that the Nation of Islam was also sophisticated in this regard. Okay, so Malcolm starts to have problems in the Nation of Islam because while they were radical in certain ways, they were in many ways similar to other Islamist movements. And I mean, we can compare, the Black nationalist Islamism in the United States is not exactly too far from Palestinian nationalist Islamism in Palestine, groups like Hamas, or Sudanese nationalist Islamism in the context of Sudan, or Iranian Islamism, which were always defined by, our local context. But yeah, the nation was limited in that they did not allow for cross-movement building in the sense that we might understand now, in the sense that we might understand Muslims in India or Dalits in India, not organizing only within their own Dalit community against casteism and Brahmanism, okay, or Muslims against similar forces, including Islamophobia, but they say, hold on, there's a margins, and I'm going to quote my ustad, my teacher, Dr. Ashraf Kunamal, who came up with this concept of the floating signifier of the margins, right? So there's always kind of these multiple margins that you can embody, you can encounter. And the attempt in creating opposition, counter-hegemony to the powers that be is to build strategic alliances from this position. So you guys, in your context, if I'm not mistaken, you found it ethical and politically correct to form an alliance, the Dalit Bahujan Muslim Alliance, okay? The Nation of Islam was against doing things like this. The Nation of Islam was in a sense isolationist, in a sense exclusivist, and in a sense apolitical in a certain way, because they didn't support people openly opposing the United States government's wars abroad. They didn't necessarily support Black Muslims within the Nation of Islam engaging in wider civil rights or human rights struggles with other formations that were not the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm is growing, and he starts to outgrow this framework. And it happens both within the United States and then also in his travels to Africa and Asia. So Malcolm leaves for the second time in his life. I mentioned the first in the late 1950s. He leaves on April 13th, 1964, to Africa and Asia. With the financial support, again, we often don't acknowledge the role of gender or women in Malcolm's story. But he had the financial support of his sister, Ella Collins, who had generously given her younger brother of her savings that she had been putting aside herself to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. for him to travel, okay? And this is when Malcolm starts to become an international figure, and he is actually treated as a diplomat, almost, when he goes abroad to Africa and Asia. So this trip, there was 2 visits in 1964 to North Africa, the Middle East, other parts of Africa, that radically transformed his sense of belonging and his political ontology and his religious sensibilities, his understandings of blackness, his understandings of Islam, his understandings of race, even outside the United States and inside the United States. So the purpose of Malcolm's first trip in 1964 was to participate in the Hajj, okay? And it's during his second trip, which was later in the year in 1964, that Malcolm's goals were developed in terms of understanding Sunni Islam, and he wanted to become a certified Sunni imam or religious leader. And he started to interact with various political movements in the Arab world, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Cairo and Gaza. He also was very, very fond, when we talk about the influence of Pan-Arabism, of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian Pan-Arabist socialist leader at that time. He met him, and he claimed him as his president because he felt what was happening through Nasser's movement in Egypt was the embodiment of this Afro-Arab Muslim internationalism that he himself was proposing. And to put Malcolm in context, Malcolm wasn't the first person to come up with this formation in relation to race, religion, and resistance for Black peoples, Muslim peoples, and other people from the third world. There was another very prominent African Muslim, actually from Egypt, a Sudanese Egyptian by the name of Dusay Muhammad Ali. And Malcolm went from west to east. Dusay Muhammad Ali went from east to west in the early 1900s, late 1800s. He actually influenced Marcus Garvey. So this framework of Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Islamism influenced the Garveyite movement itself by way of Dusay Muhammad Ali. And he continued in many other ways to put forward that framework. So I'm just mentioning this because Malcolm was part of a wider constellation of political ideologies, of belonging, of connection to race and religion at that time. He did do unique things theoretically, but I think really the reason why we know Malcolm more than someone like Dusay Muhammad Ali is because of his praxis and the effectiveness that his praxis had in not only building the Nation of Islam and challenging the American political structure and Western political structure to the extent that they created a situation to kill him, which they did. Allah yarhamuhu, may he rest in peace. But the afterlife of this praxis and story is something that has shaped so many of us in trying to grapple with the multiple belongings we have and the various ways we relate to our tribe, to our race, to our religion, to our caste, okay? And I think it's important, I mean, especially in your guys' context, if I understand correctly, right now, it seems that a lot of, these liberal or secular Marxist leftists are trying to claim Malcolm and claim solidarity with Black Lives Matter in the United States. And they don't care about what's happening, or they don't show the same solidarity to Dalits and Muslims inside India itself because of their Islamophobia, because of their casteism. So in making Malcolm's life complex, I hope that I'm not suggesting this kind of liberal multiculturalism, we can pick and choose who we want to be. No, this is not what I'm getting at, okay? We are making Malcolm's life a bit more complex so that we can understand the various ways that his praxis, his political ideology, race and religion worked in his life. in the context of social struggle and making arguments, we must claim a more solidified understanding of Malcolm. We say, no, to hell with you, you Brahmanists, to hell with you, you racists, you Islamophobes. That's not Malcolm, this is Malcolm. He was a Black Muslim revolutionary. So please don't get me wrong, okay? I'm not suggesting this kind of very liberal, and there's debates like this that occurred in the literature. I'm sure many have encountered this book, The Life of Reinvention by Manning Marable, which was written about Malcolm X, which it had a lot of great historical new information about Malcolm. And I think, in all honesty, it was a very good contribution to Malcolmite scholarship, a significant contribution. But we saw after its publication, and especially with some of the framings they had of Malcolm that many would argue are starting to fit into the power structures of our times, you had the response of a primarily Black left, radical Black left, Black nationalist left, that critiqued the many ways that they attempted, that Marable's book, whether by his choice or the publisher's choice, chose to make Malcolm fit in, okay, fit into this multicultural America. We want to make this radical Malcolm fit in to the multicultural, multi-religious, multi-caste India. We want a palatable Malcolm. We want a Malcolm that tastes like really, really good biryani. No, Malcolm will spit in that biryani. Malcolm and many people who are inspired by Malcolm do not support this understanding of his legacy and his praxis. So I think when we make these complexities more clear in terms of Malcolm's life, we shouldn't go in that direction of the secular left, the economic reductionist Marxist left, the casteist left, the white left. We need to create other understanding, because our times now have different contestations and different formations of power. If we would like, if people feel that we are tired or that this conversation has gone a bit too long, I can stop here, Sirudis. I do have a bit more to formulate for this period for Malcolm. If possible, I would love to work through it in the next 5 to 10 minutes. If that's too long, I can understand, and we can stop here.
Hello, sir. Actually, we have scheduled the meeting till 9 p.m. We can extend it a little bit, but I think we can have we can extend the talk through discussion and questions what our participants are having. So we can have, I think we can move on to the discussion part. So you can broaden the thoughts that you have explained before.
Okay, if that's what's best for you, that's fine. No worries.
So we request the participants who are having the questions or any opinions can raise the hand, so we can go in order.
How is this going to work, Sirudis? Am I going to listen to people asking questions? Are they going to be just asking me? Are they speaking to other people? How is this working?
No, they will be asking to you directly, so you can reply to them individually.
Are they going to be typing, or they're going to be speaking?
I think they will be speaking, sir. They will be speaking.
Okay, and please, you don't need to call me sir, comrade. You can call me
okay. Fine. So there is one Muhammad Ashraf. You can raise the question. Hello, Muhammad Ashraf. Hello? Who are having question, please raise the hand so we can go.
Or Sudesh, you can ask other people to maybe he's having a.
So Abdul Hadi is there. Abdul Hadi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Okay, please raise your question. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Iskander Abbasi. First of all, I'm so happy to meet you. The second thing, I'm not from a political science background, or not from sociology, so my question will be a little bit, primitive. But still, I just want to know why we Muslims in India don't have. It's a two-faced question. Why Muslims in India don't have a leader, at least like Malcolm X, after the earlier leaders of Indian independence movement, like Abul Kalam Azad, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar. I think Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar and the likes were a little bit like Malcolm X. And why don't we have such leaders? A little bit arrogant, adamant and resilient leaders, more than passive and a little bit more Gandhian type of leaders like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. I'm pointing on people like Maulana Muhammad Ali Jawhar and the resemblance to Malcolm X. And the second thing, why don't we have, why we didn't have a great alliance between Muslims and Dalits, even during America. I mean, I know sometimes you might not be the rightest person to answer all those things, but I'm just raising this. Thanks. Somebody.
Okay, thank you. Shukran, Abdul Hadi. Thank you. I think many parts of your questions are a bit out of my zone and ability to answer. I'm not as familiar with your context to be able to answer those questions. There is one aspect of the question I feel I can comment on, and it's the aspect of you asking about why do we not have leaders like Malcolm X within the Muslim community in India. I don't know when it comes to community formation, social movement praxis. I don't know if thinking about leaders and only understand, I'm not saying that you're doing this, but you're making me think of this and reflect on this. I don't know if thinking of leaders as the driver of the movement or as the most significant part of the movement is the most effective, because leaders, they come from communities. I think that it's important to have leaders and leadership. I'm not saying that it's not important to have figures, to have Ambedkar, okay, to have Maududi, okay, to have Ali Shariati, to have Malcolm X, to have many figures, past or present, that inspire us. That's not what I'm saying. But when it comes to social movements, I think that ideally the focus should be on the communal. I think it should be focused on how people negate, not completely, but negate the ego to put forward the demands and the aspirations of the community, or else we can potentially fall into celebrity worship. And for Muslims, at least, this is almost like a type of shirk. This is a type of idol worship. When actually, that flag that you saw, which conquered Mecca, that flag which you saw from the Untitled movement that made its contributions and improvements to fighting casteism, the flag, the individual flag you saw from Muslims fighting against the fascism and the Hindu supremacy in India, we reduce our struggles to this flag. And we forget that the flag is carried by the wind. The wind, this is the community, this is the many unnamed and unknown individuals who work day in and day out, sometimes in very menial ways, sometimes, you just make flyers, you just text WhatsApps, you just run this place, you run that place, you feed people. But those are the people who also just as much make the flag and lead it towards victory. So that's the one aspect that I feel like I can reflect on with you, with your question. Apologies, I can't, it's very difficult to answer the other aspects.
So there is a question from Nahla Muhammad. She has put in the chat box. She's asking, how does Islamophilia and Islamophobia works as a colonial agenda? So
sorry, Comrade Sirudis, can you please repeat the question?
How does Islamophilia and Islamophobia works as a colonial agenda? Same.
How does Islamophilia and Islamophobia advance the colonial agenda?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think these terms are very useful for understanding other terms that are related to these terms. So if people have encountered this idea of the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary, that's very relevant because the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary is based on the Islamophilia, Islamophobia binary, right? So what's the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary? The good Muslim, bad Muslim binary is the way that the power structure in different places, at times it's the Western power structure, at other times it's the Hindutva power structure, they discipline Muslims by categorizing them from a fundamentally anti-Muslim racist perspective. And they attempt to make so-called good Muslims and so-called bad Muslims. What does that mean? Good Muslims are Muslims who conform to the system. Good Muslims have an interpretation of Islam that conforms to liberalism, that conforms to white supremacy, Western supremacy, that conforms to capitalism, to coloniality. Good Muslims are Muslims who say nothing about caste and Brahmanism. And that's done through Islamophilia from the center of power, okay? And they make allies, they make friends, right? Philia with the good Muslim. The bad Muslim is the Muslims who, in many different ways, they confront, they critique, and they oppose the oppressive power system. They are very critical of liberalism. They fight against capitalism. They fight against Hindutva. They fight against casteism. They fight against, secular supremacy, Hindutva. So there's a wide spectrum on the bad Muslim analysis. I'm not saying that anyone who opposes is necessarily good or ethical, right? So when we have certain groups like Daesh or ISIS, who are also technically bad Muslims, right? According to Islamophobia and making this Muslim enemy versus the Muslim friend, that's not to say that that's the path we should go, okay? It's not also to say that Muslims should be apologetic about ISIS and its interpretation of Islam. The people who are running certain extreme, quote unquote, extremist movements or fundamentalist movements. And again, that's thrown at many different people in various ways that don't make sense analytically. We have our problems, we have our issues, but we are not the problem. We are not the issue. The power structure, the West, the powers that be, they're the problem. They are the issue. So we can be problematic and we need to deal with that, but we need to not be confused when it comes to the way they make us friends and enemies. They make us good and bad Muslims. They use Islamophilia and Islamophobia to divide us, to fracture us. So I think those are some ways that that binary works, and that I think we see in your context, in the context of the United States, of the Muslim world. Yeah.
So, okay, there is a question from Harsha AR. So she's asking what specific aspects of the nation of Islam and of Elijah Muhammad led to Malcolm's split with them?
Led to Malcolm's what, comrade?
What specific aspects of the nation of Islam and of Elijah Muhammad led to Malcolm's split with them?
Okay, so I guess I can move forward with what I wanted to finish with to answer this question, if that's okay. So basically, as I was sharing, Malcolm started to feel too confined, and he was actually having conflict within the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad engaged in a number of abuses within the community that he covered up for many years. Issues of gender and sexual abuse specifically, in which he was fathering multiple children from different wives. That's one reason that Malcolm started to lose his faith in Elijah Muhammad. He became very critical of the ethical character of Elijah Muhammad. Another was the political project of what the Nation of Islam was doing at that time. As I was sharing earlier, they were becoming, they were not engaging wider movements. And Malcolm was moving beyond that. Malcolm was becoming more internationalist in his connections to Africa, his connections to the Muslim world, his connections to religion, race, blackness, Islam. And whereas previously, he would have only fought for something like revolutionary change through conversion to the Nation of Islam, he began to move in a direction where he said, look, this isn't only about converting people to this sect. This is about ending the genocide, the continued enslavement and oppression of Black peoples and all oppressed peoples all over the world. And he was really engaging in a critique in the United States, which is known as the civil rights versus human rights debate. So whereas leaders, and this is also the way that Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, they differed for a long time. Towards the end of both of their lives, they started to become a bit closer. Malcolm X started to become more open to less exclusionary politics, and Martin Luther King Jr. began to become a bit more radical in his understanding of the ontological, the structural nature of anti-Black racism and oppression inside America. So he wanted to move from only focusing not only on, this more insular Black Muslim movement within the United States. He wanted to focus not only on a civil rights movement within the United States that didn't question the fundamental character of America's oppressive nature or question America's imperial nature outside of its borders. Malcolm X began to argue for a human rights perspective, which internationalized the Black struggle inside the United States. So he starts to meet with all of these great leaders in Africa and Asia, Gamal Abdel Nasser, anti-colonial liberation leaders in West Africa, he moves away, and he forms. And I think this is, this is again my own interpretation. But he forms two organizations after leaving the Nation of Islam, right? One of them is called Muslim Mosque Inc., which was a quote unquote religious organization that focused on bringing Sunni Orthodox Islam to Black Muslims in the United States. And he started another organization called the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which he modeled off the Organization for African Unity in Africa, and also organizations that Pan-Arabists were building in the Nasserite movements. And this was a quote unquote secular organization that would be the modality for kind of a cross-movement building and alliance in the United States. And unfortunately, it's within that year where he starts to move away. He starts to become this international figure that the powers that be within the United States and internationally, right? Because Malcolm was feared by other Western powers. Malcolm attempted to visit France on his visits, to Africa and Asia, and he was denied entry into France. You can say it's part of American pressure, but there's an alliance between America and France there that, look, this guy's dangerous. We can't have him, be spreading his hate speech, quote unquote. So Malcolm became, he grew out of his quote unquote old clothes. I don't say that to denigrate the Nation of Islam and the radical nature of what they were doing at that time and continue to do since then and still do now. But those are some of the reasons and things that were happening. And this last point I want to say, just to kind of conclude with that part 3 that I was getting at, is that for me, this moment is when Malcolm X shifts from a normative Black Islamism to a type of Islamic liberation theology. Right? So for people who are potentially unfamiliar with liberation theology, that's a term that comes out of various Christian movements initially that were reinterpreting Christianity in a way that critiqued the imperial Christianity, critiqued the capitalist Christianity, and the Christianity that did not care for the poor. And very soon after that, there have been a number of Muslims globally, especially in the English language, writing about Islamic liberation theology. Your very own Dr. Ashraf Kunamal is one of them, and a very, very important one. His work is really going to redefine our field. But Malcolm's move here, and I don't use Islamic liberation theology in this popular loose sense of just anything that's resistance to oppression is Islamic liberation theology. I think it's important that we have multiple ways of understanding resistance from Muslims, that we have an understanding of Islamist resistance, we have an understanding of other people who just call themselves, Muslim activists, and they don't care for these other kind of labels of liberation theology or whatever. But he specifically moves to Islamic liberation theology for me for 3 reasons. And this is found within the literature and discourse of Islamic liberation theology. One is that he moves in a post-essentialist direction in terms of his political ideology and his political praxis. He moves away from kind of essentialist categories of race and religion that he seemed to have embodied in certain ways in the Nation of Islam. And he opens up to a more post-essentialist understanding of religion and race that allows him to be committed to Pan-Africanism, to Pan-Islamism, to Pan-Arabism. The second is his commitment, his growing commitment to a type of pluralism, and I mean pluralism from below. I don't mean this liberal, multicultural pluralism, multi-faith, where people just come and they say, oh, your Quran says something nice, my Bible says something nice, your Bhagavad Gita is, you know, it's wonderful. It says nothing about the killing of lower caste people. I'm talking about a pluralism, a deep commitment to a multiversality, a pluriversality, right? From below, where he's willing now to work with people who don't necessarily share his platform, but they are in opposition together, ethically and politically, against the unethical oppressive power structures. Okay, and the last one is his fundamental tarjih, okay, his preference for the mustada'afun fil ard, the wretched and oppressed of the earth. So that is probably the most central aspect of Islamic liberation theology, is the preferential option for the oppressed, the mustada'afin. And Malcolm is very clear in widening his understanding of the oppressed and his commitment to those very oppressed communities. So through his travels in Africa and Asia, he starts to make all these connections where he says, oh, Spain and the Moroccans, this is Al-Andalus. He's talking about the colonization and genocide that happened in Al-Andalus, and that the Moroccans, or, you know, the Muslims that were there who were indigenous. He is talking about Palestine and Israel and saying the Palestinians were the indigenous and they're fighting that oppressor. He's talking about the blacks and the natives in the Americas and their relationship to this. So he is widening his understanding and commitment to this margins, this floating signifier of the margins.
Okay, there is a question from Jerome Samraj. Sir, you may ask the question directly to Abbasi, please.
Yeah. Abbasi, thanks for your presentation. I hope, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So it was very nice to hear about Malcolm X and the Black Islam movement and whatever changes that we have been discussing so far. And I have a question, little out of curiosity. The thing is that the pandemic, we were in a situation where we thought that this modern economic development process is irreversible and we have no other way out to escape from this process. But now what we have seen is that this pandemic has put a stall on it. It has given us a space of more than 2 months. Now it will extend. It will go to more than 3-4 months and so on. So in that sense, I feel that this should be an end of the era. End of the era of modern, capitalist accumulative economic system. And I feel in that sense, being in the US, the protests going on and the kind of socio-economic situation of the people, it would be better if you can comment on that. How do you see is there a possibility of this being an end of an era? Because I certainly wish, witnessing the kind of crisis that is ongoing in India, where the people are now walking on the roads, taking thousands of kilometers by foot, and we also see a kind of an apathy against it, where all the political leaders and the intellectuals are talking about the rights of the laborers from sympathetic point of view, not from the right point of view. Right? They address the entire migrant issue from the sympathetic point of view and not as a right of the workers. So in that sense, I feel that this should be, and I very much want this to be an end of an era, but I do not know whether that will be how that is possible there. And one other additional thing is that one other problem that keeps us running throughout is the interest, the idea of interest that we pay on our loans. And I feel that all the when individuals are enslaved to loans, we have countries becoming enslaved to IMF, World Bank, and the developed countries in terms of loans. And in that sense, I feel that there should be a breakthrough. And this, if the political leaders of the third world are little shrewd on it, this itself can be an end of this era. And I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sure, I mean, you had very valuable understandings of what's happening. I don't know if I can top your analysis. I agree with you. I agree that it's a moment in history where the fundamental nature of certain systems are being questioned. We are encountering a finitude. We are encountering a certain end in this idea of progress that the modern world has based itself on. This idea of endless growth, endless exponential growth, especially through the capitalist world system, the neoliberal capitalist world system. And I think yeah, I mean, if this is not a message, and I mean, I don't mean to get religious now, but I am, I consider myself a Muslim liberation theologian, and I happen to do, my PhD is going to focus on this topic of the Quran and ecological justice. How many times have we seen in the Quran that God destroys a people for the way they treat the environment? The people of Thamud, okay? There's countless examples from the lives of the prophets, from the story of Musa and Khidr even, of God, if we're talking about a religious understanding, which is not the only way to understand this social phenomena, that justice and the ethical horizon we should strive for is not one that creates such an imbalance between nature, which humans are not, we're not apart from nature. We are a part of nature. We are a part of that ecosystem, right? So the relationship between non-human creation, human creation, and the way that we use material goods, services, economic systems. When we create an imbalance and abuse these relationships, and now we can just go back to a very secular understanding, we are going to encounter a finitude because the earth is finite. And if we keep using the resources, the land, the way that we're using, and when I say we, okay, let's clarify. It's not really just we. It is the white Western-led elites who firstly put us in this situation. And in the context of India, it might also be the Brahminist class and the casteist class who are also controlling all these resources and causing the ecological destruction that led to our current crisis. We cannot untie ourselves from the way we've abused that relationship, the way we did not prepare our social welfare systems to even deal with something like this, the way we did not prepare our relationship to animals, and the way that we were encountering animals in the wild, going deeper into the wild, and now eating animals, because people don't live lives that are sustainable, they're forced through capitalism to go and encounter these animals that we never ate before, that have viruses. And you put these things together and it's a bomb. And we're not talking about 9/11. This is what they created. This is what the West created. So I'm not saying that to absolve us of responsibility. We must be committed ourselves as people who are critical of the system, on the margins, as Dalits, as Muslims, as even, I mean, we need our white brothers and sisters. We need our people with this privilege to also commit, a type of shirk against their commitment, a type of apostasy against the system that they sit at the top of.
Okay, thank you, Abbasi. And I think there is a question from Muhammad Danish. Please. Hello, Muhammad Danish. He is not responding now. So, is there someone who is having the whole question? So, please. So, there is a question from Afifa Ahmad. Can you please elaborate on pluralism as advanced by Malcolm?
Sure. Well, I can try, Comrade Afifa. You might have asked me a question now I don't have the answer to. Okay, there is, if I can bring a bit more of the literature that reflects also on Praxis from two different Muslim scholars who have written about Malcolm X, and specifically a Muslim political identity founded in the life and praxis of Malcolm X. They talk about pluralism. So let me attempt to answer this question through sharing their contributions. So there is a very good book if people are interested in learning more about Malcolm X, religion, race, resistance, by a Afghani American scholar by the name of Suhail Dalatsai. The book's name is Black Star Crescent Moon. And in this book, Dalatsai argues for a political identity, political ontology that he calls the Muslim International. So this is his description. The Muslim International is a grounding for Muslim agency to form in a border zone that is in opposition to the powers that be. It is here that the politics of the Muslim International is revealed and elaborated. It is a site of contact and difference within and across territories, a perpetual border zone where ideas about justice, agency, and self-determination take root and are given shape. Dalatsai continues. The Muslim International is not geographically located. Instead, it is composed of not only multiple and overlapping diasporas that have resulted from slavery, colonialism, and migration, but also by communities and collectives that have been shaped by uneven and disparate relationships to nation states, capitalism, and imperial power. A zone of struggle and solidarity in which new kinds of politics emerge. The Muslim International shapes and is shaped by the convergent histories and narratives that are central to the shared struggles of these overlapping diasporas. For those diverse histories and narratives are what influence the various modes of resistance and forms of mobilization that have continued to challenge power in enduring ways. Now, just one more small point. Decolonial Muslim thinker Salman Sayyid comments on Dalatsai's Muslim International concept, saying that the Muslim International is a political agent that brings the facts of the Ummah into the world. And he points to the innovation through the Muslim International of a post-national Muslim politics, and arguably a post, what we would call pietistic. Okay, I'll come back to that. In which the Westphalian state does not constrain the expression of an Islamicate identity, and this expression is articulated with various decolonial discourses in such a way that the Muslim International becomes the surface of inscription for decolonial demands. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of pluralism? These are people who are continuing Malcolm's legacy and interpreting Malcolm. And the way that they, along many others, have interpreted Malcolm is best demonstrated through another quote. Okay, so if you can bear with me, because I think this quote from another scholar who's interpreted Malcolm's legacy in relation to pluralism, it really gets at the this idea of pluralism, whether it's political pluralism, right? So you're not just attached to old school nationalist movements. You're not just attached to certain communalist identifications. You're not just attached to certain theological or creedal attachments. Think Sunni, Shia, minority sects. Okay, this is Hamid Dabashi, who has a book, Islamic Liberation Theology. And similar to the Muslim International, he comes up with this idea of the Muslim revolutionary. Okay, and he says, with every move, he, meaning Malcolm and the Muslim Malcolm, expanded what it meant to be a Muslim revolutionary in terms of tolerance of diversity and dissent and intolerance of dogmatism and essentialism, right? So if you remember this point, this is why I say that Malcolm moved from a Black Islamism to a Black American informed Islamic liberation theology. Dabashi continues, in his identitarian inauthenticities, for he ran away from many stereotypes. He, Malcolm, was far more of an authentic revolutionary, his religious monotheism always seasoned by a political polytheism. That's the crux. His religious monotheism always seasoned by a political polytheism. For Islam in its widest and most global reach to become a relevant force in the age of rapid globalization, in the age of this expansive, tolerant, self-transformative, and autocritical legacy of Malcolm X, he's come to become an exemplary of this Muslim revolutionary. Malcolm X had a reckoning with Islam in terms of this pluralism and post-essentialist approach, and it is time that Islam had a reckoning with Malcolm X.
Okay, there is another question. What argument do you propose to counter the left narrative which disregards the Islamic essence in his politics, which terms him as a reactionary for most of his life, then as a Pan-African socialist?
I just want to ask Sirudis,
Okay.
is it only going to be in a question-answer form, or do other people, are they also able, can I converse with them and can they also share some of their thoughts?
Actually, we plan to ask the question from the participant directly, but most of the people are putting the question in chat box. So this is the only option we can have right now.
Okay. Okay, no, I can understand the limits. I'm not a particular fan of just, I'm the sheikh, I'm the guru, and I don't know all the answers, okay? So I'm
Okay.
nervous and I feel bad thinking, well, I have to answer every question. Okay, so now I forgot. Okay, no, now I remember the question. So the issue partially, especially when you're dealing within Pan-Africanist and Black nationalists, I can use this example because I'm intimately familiar, engaged and actually writing on it at the moment. When you engage, for example, the certain strands within Pan-Africanist and Black nationalist and Black left movements, they also have this view that downplays Malcolm's Islam. And it's not necessarily coming from the Black Muslims. The Black Muslims within those movements are spot on and really good about challenging this, but they are a minority within the wider kind of Pan-Africanist Black nationalist movements. And one problem is that when we think of the way we understand the world, the knowledge that we've internalized, we don't realize that in certain ways we've internalized very colonial understandings of Islam. Edward Said's Orientalism, I mean, that broke open a whole can of worms. That really shifted the understanding in the social sciences that these Westerners are not the only people who can write about the East and Islam. And he came up with this word, Orientalism, to describe the way that they, in part, had a very problematic, ahistorical, unnuanced understanding of Islam's presence in various regions. So African and Black Muslims themselves have come to name another form of Orientalism. And they call it Black Orientalism. Because within Pan-Africanist, Black nationalist discourse, you have Orientalists as well. And they internalized the Western view of Islam in the African world. And the critiques have come from Black and African Muslims themselves to say that this is very problematic. And certain discussions like the so-called Arab slave trades in Africa and Asia, Islam being viewed as a colonial religion in Africa. I mean, it's very similar to India right now, where, you know, the Hindutva forces are saying Islam was colonial in India. This is, it's nonsense. It's ahistorical. It's coming from a very reactionary position. It's coming from a very Islamophobic position. So similarly, when people talk about Malcolm, inevitably, look, when someone like Malcolm dies, there's going to be contestations, and we have to affirm that there are different ways people can interpret his legacy and continue his legacy. So Muslims cannot only claim Malcolm as a Muslim. Okay, Malcolm was a firm Black man. He was a firm Black nationalist. At the same time, because of structural Islamophobia through Eurocentric social sciences, even within the Black left, Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist movements, and movements more broadly, they de-emphasize Malcolm's relationship to Islam. But actually, when you look at his life, and not only the sayings that I shared, I mean, Malcolm was a minister. He was a deeply religious Muslim within the Nation of Islam. He taught classes on theology. He encouraged people to pray. He had a deep spiritual connection with Allah. So it's when you just literally look at his life, you're like, you guys are crazy from the personal aspect. From the social aspect, again, when people die, because of the nature of the social sciences and how knowledge is structured, they will overemphasize certain areas over others. So Islam got de-emphasized for the last, he died in 1965, 4 or 5 decades later. There were always people who were saying, no, Islam was very important during his life. But it's actually only in the last decade or two that you're having more prominent publications interrogating his actual engagements with Pan-Islamism, for example. So Maytha al-Hassan, in her PhD dissertation, documented in original ways, I mean, stuff that many people didn't talk about in mainstream Malcolmite scholarship, that he engaged the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. When he was in Egypt and Saudi, and I believe in Switzerland, he was very influenced by Azam Pasha, and specifically his text, The Eternal Message. He also was in conversation and partially supported by Saeed Ramadan, who is related to Hassan al-Banna, and on his Malcolm's critique of two things really are actually, in my opinion, impossible if we don't acknowledge his pan-Islamist engagement. The first one is his critique of materialism within leftist communist movements. It seems clear that Malcolm, socialists claim him after his life, but Malcolm was never explicitly putting forward a socialist or communist platform. And at times when he spoke about it, he was very critical of the materialism, the kind of economic reductionism, this idea that we are only homo economicus, right? That's the first critique. That, I mean, I don't see any other way than his engagement through pan-Islamists who were suffering under certain communist regimes whether in Central Asia and what's happening with the Soviet project, or in the Arab world, where you have the tension between Islamism and Kemalism. The second is Zionism. Arguably, he could have got that critique from Pan-Arabists, but at the same time, he was engaging Palestinians in the PLO and in Gaza, who shared with him, from an Islamic perspective, their engagement and struggle. He gave a lecture in Beirut to the Lebanese Muslim Brotherhood. And they were very, very strong in their Zionism. And up until that point in the Black struggle in the United States, all of the other formations, the Black Christian formations, the liberal civil society formations, and the Black secular left, if we might say socialist communist, they didn't have this understanding of Zionism or the critique of materiality within communism. So for me, yeah, those are some of the reasons why it was marginalized, but his engagements with Islam also made him very different, and he set the tone for a new direction in radical politics in the United States, undeniably, through his engagements with Islam.
So, comrade, actually, we have already exceeded our time limit, and you know, this is because of the Zoom. We have certain limits to conduct the meeting. So I think we can wind up for now, and we can have more meetings or more discussions in the future. I hope it will happen. So on behalf of Spaceless Collective and Dr. K. Ashraf, we thank Iskander Abbasi for having a wonderful discussion, a wonderful thought-provoking discussion about Malcolm X, and also about the Black movement, the Black Islamic movements happening in the European context, as well as in the US. So we actually loved your presentation, loved your thoughts and opinions about the Black movements. So we thank you once again, brother Abbasi. So I think we can wind up right now.
Okay, no, thank you very much. It was my privilege, my pleasure to share space with you, Comrade Sirudis, with the Spaceless Collective and the countless other people on the call. If there's anything I'd want to finish in saying, Jai Bhim, Jai Mim.
Jai Bhim.
Thank you, guys.